The National Museum of African American History and Culture houses extensive documentation of sexual violence under slavery, but most of this evidence comes from historians' later research rather than from contemporary testimony by survivors themselves. Sexual violence was so pervasive and so systematically hidden that enslaved women rarely had opportunity to testify publicly about what had been done to them. On a morning in January 2025, archivist Dr. Teresa Mitchell opens a package that will lead her to uncover one of the most powerful and detailed testimonies ever given by a survivor of sexual violence under slavery. A woman in Alabama who survived abuse by 3 different enslavers, who secretly documented what she witnessed and experienced, and who after emancipation gave testimony so detailed and damning that it destroyed the reputations of 3 prominent Alabama families and helped establish the historical record of sexual violence as one of slavery's most horrific but hidden crimes. The donation comes from a historical society in Alabama that has been researching Freedmen's Bureau records and testimony from formerly enslaved people. The letter explains that while examining materials from 1866, 1867, researchers discovered extensive testimony from a woman named Hannah, who described in extraordinary detail the sexual violence she and other enslaved women experienced, naming specific enslavers and providing documentation that corroborated her accounts. Testimony so powerful that it led to social ostracism of 3 families and helped expose the systematic sexual exploitation that had been hidden throughout slavery. Teresa carefully removes the materials from their archival box. The first item is a photograph, styled like a late 19th century portrait, showing a young black woman seated against a softly blurred backdrop. She appears to be in her late teens or early 20s, wearing a plain, high-necked work dress beneath a light-colored pinafore that shows visible stains, evidence of labor rather than leisure. Her hair is neatly wrapped in a cloth covering. She looks directly at the camera with a calm, steady gaze, eyes wide, expression neutral, neither smiling nor afraid. There's a quiet maturity in her expression that seems older than her apparent age, as if she has learned to be perfectly still under scrutiny. Teresa turns the photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Hannah, Alabama, 1867. Photograph taken 2 years after emancipation. Hannah was enslaved by 3 different families between 1858 and 1865. During those years, she was repeatedly sexually assaulted by her enslavers and witnessed similar violence against other enslaved women. In 1866, 1867, Hannah gave detailed testimony to Freedmen's Bureau officials, documenting the sexual violence she experienced and witnessed. Her testimony destroyed the reputations of 3 prominent Alabama families and provided crucial documentation of sexual violence under slavery. And below that, in different handwriting, added much later, she was 14 when it started. She survived 7 years of systematic abuse by 3 different men. Then she testified, naming names, providing details, corroborating her account with documentation she had secretly kept. She destroyed their reputations through truth-telling. This is her story. Teresa reads the inscription 3 times, her throat tight. Hannah had been 14 years old when sexual violence began, a child when she was first assaulted. She had survived abuse by 3 different enslavers over 7 years, and after emancipation, she had given testimony so detailed and so well documented that it had destroyed the reputations of 3 prominent families by exposing crimes they had committed and hidden throughout slavery. Teresa spends the rest of that day examining the other materials in the package. What she finds is extraordinary. Hannah's complete testimony given to Freedmen's Bureau officials in 1866 and 1867, comprising over 100 pages of detailed accounts of sexual violence she experienced and witnessed. Documentation Hannah had secretly kept during slavery. Dates, details, corroborating evidence. Letters and newspaper accounts from 1867, 1868, describing the scandal Hannah's testimony created and the social destruction of the 3 families she named. And most remarkably, a follow-up account Hannah gave in 1875, explaining why she had chosen to testify, despite knowing the consequences. From Hannah's testimony, given to Freedmen's Bureau officials in Montgomery, Alabama, in March 1866. My name is Hannah. I was born enslaved in Alabama in 1844. I am now 22 years old and have been free for 1 year. I am giving this testimony because I want the crimes that were committed against me and other enslaved women to be documented and known. I want the men who committed these crimes to be named and exposed. I want people in the future to understand that sexual violence was not an occasional aberration of slavery. It was systematic, pervasive, and used deliberately to control and dehumanize enslaved women. I will describe what happened to me and what I witnessed. I will name the men who committed these crimes. I understand that my testimony may not result in criminal prosecution. I have been told that the legal system will likely not punish white men for raping enslaved women, even though slavery has ended. But I want the truth documented. I want these men's names attached to their crimes. I want their families and communities to know what they did. I was enslaved on a plantation outside Montgomery until I was approximately 14 years old. In 1858, when I was 14, I was sold to a man named Thomas Whitfield, who owned a smaller farm about 30 miles from Montgomery. Whitfield purchased me specifically to work as a house servant for his wife and to be available to him sexually. Whitfield began raping me within days of purchasing me. I was 14 years old. I tried to resist the first time, and he beat me severely, so severely that I could not work for several days afterward. He made clear that resistance would result in worse beatings, and that if I told his wife or anyone else, he would have me whipped publicly and then sold to a plantation where conditions would be much worse. For the next 2 years, Whitfield raped me regularly, sometimes multiple times per week, sometimes less frequently, but always with the understanding that I had no power to refuse, that my body was his property to use as he wished. During this time, I also witnessed Whitfield raping other enslaved women on his property. There were 3 other young women who were subjected to the same treatment I experienced. We never spoke about it openly. We were too afraid. But we knew what was happening to each of us. In 1860, Whitfield sold me. I learned later that his wife had become suspicious about his behavior with me and had demanded that I be sold. Whitfield sold me to a man named William Patterson, who owned a larger plantation about 50 miles from Montgomery. Patterson also raped me, though his pattern was different from Whitfield's. Patterson would force himself on me approximately once or twice per month, usually when his wife was away visiting family. Patterson also frequently beat me, not just as punishment for supposed infractions, but seemingly for his own pleasure. He would strike me and then force himself on me afterward. I remained enslaved by Patterson from 1860 until 1863. During those 3 years, I was raped by Patterson dozens of times. I also witnessed him raping other enslaved women, particularly younger women who worked in the house. In 1863, Patterson sold me to a man named Robert Harrison, who owned property closer to Montgomery. I was sold because Patterson's financial situation had worsened during the war, and he needed to sell some of his enslaved people to raise money. Harrison was the worst of the three. He raped me more frequently, sometimes multiple times per week. He was also more violent, often choking me or threatening to kill me if I made noise or tried to resist. Harrison seemed to take pleasure in causing pain during the assaults. Harrison also forced me to participate in situations where he raped other enslaved women while I was present, apparently deriving additional pleasure from forcing me to witness his assaults on others. I remained enslaved by Harrison from 1863 until emancipation came to Alabama in 1865. During those 2 years, I was raped by Harrison well over 100 times. I also witnessed him raping at least 4 other enslaved women regularly. Throughout these 7 years of systematic sexual violence, I was also forced to continue my work as a house servant. I was expected to serve meals to these men and their families, to clean their homes, to be polite and deferential, all while being raped by them regularly. The psychological torture of this, serving dinner to a man who had raped me the night before, smiling and acting normal while carrying the trauma of what he had done, was almost as devastating as the physical violence itself. I want to be clear about something. What these men did was rape. It was not consensual. It was not a relationship. Enslaved women could not consent to sexual contact with the men who owned us. We had no power to refuse, and refusal would result in beatings, torture, or death. When a man who owns you as property forces himself on you sexually, that is rape, regardless of whether he uses explicit physical violence in that particular moment. I also want to document that I was not alone in experiencing this. Sexual violence against enslaved women was systematic and pervasive. Every enslaved woman I knew either experienced sexual violence directly or knew other women who did. This was not the behavior of a few aberrant individuals. This was a feature of slavery, enabled by the legal system that made black women's bodies property that white men could use as they wished. During my years in slavery, I began secretly keeping records of what was being done to me and what I witnessed. I had been taught to read and write by another enslaved person when I was young. I kept small pieces of paper hidden, and I would occasionally write down dates, details, names of victims. I kept these records hidden in places enslavers would not look. I kept them because I believed, I hoped, that slavery would someday end, and that there would be opportunity to testify about what had been done. When emancipation came in 1865, I was 21 years old. I had been subjected to sexual violence for 7 years. I had been raped hundreds of times by 3 different men. I had witnessed countless other women being raped. I took my hidden records, and I began seeking opportunity to testify. I contacted Freedmen's Bureau officials and told them I wanted to document what had been done to enslaved women. I wanted to name the men who had committed these crimes. I wanted their families and communities to know the truth. I am now providing detailed testimony about Thomas Whitfield, William Patterson, and Robert Harrison. I am naming them as rapists. I am documenting what they did to me and to other enslaved women. I am providing dates, details, and corroboration from my secret records. I understand that my testimony will likely not result in criminal prosecution. I have been told that Alabama's legal system will not prosecute white men for raping black women, even now that slavery has ended. But I do not need criminal prosecution to achieve justice. I need the truth to be known. I need these men's names to be permanently associated with their crimes. I need their families to know what they did. I need their communities to judge them. I will provide specific details about each assault I experienced and witnessed. I will name other enslaved women who were victims, those who are alive, and those who died. I will show the documentation I kept. And I will destroy these men's reputations by making it impossible for them to hide behind respectability and silence. Teresa reads through Hannah's testimony, which continues for over 100 pages, documenting specific instances of sexual violence with dates, details, and corroborating information. Hannah names 8 other enslaved women who were victims of the 3 men she is testifying against. She provides information she secretly recorded during slavery. She explains the patterns of behavior, the threats used to ensure silence, the ways enslavers created situations where sexual violence could occur without witnesses. The testimony is devastating in its detail and in Hannah's clear determination to document everything, despite knowing that reading and transcribing this testimony would be traumatic for everyone involved. Teresa contacts Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian at the University of Alabama, who specializes in sexual violence under slavery and the testimony given by formerly enslaved women after emancipation. Marcus has spent decades researching this history, trying to document crimes that were systematically hidden and rarely testified about publicly. Marcus calls her back within an hour, his voice shaking with emotion. Hannah's testimony, if it's as detailed as you've described, would be one of the most complete accounts we have of sexual violence under slavery from a survivor's perspective. Most testimony is fragmentary or indirect. If Hannah gave over 100 pages of detailed testimony, naming specific enslavers and documenting specific assaults, that's extraordinary. Send me everything immediately. Teresa shares all the materials with Marcus. They arrange to meet at the Alabama Department of Archives and History in Montgomery to examine any additional records about Hannah's testimony, the 3 families she named, and the impact her testimony had. Over the following weeks, Teresa and Marcus piece together the complete story of Hannah's testimony and its consequences. They find extensive corroborating documentation that confirms Hannah's testimony was taken seriously by Freedmen's Bureau officials, that efforts were made to investigate her claims, and that her testimony created a massive scandal in Alabama in 1867-1868 that destroyed the reputations of the Whitfield, Patterson, and Harrison families. From Freedmen's Bureau reports, they find that officials interviewed other formerly enslaved women who corroborated Hannah's testimony. Several women confirmed they had been raped by the same men Hannah named. Others confirmed witnessing assaults. The documentation Hannah had secretly kept during slavery, small pieces of paper with dates and brief details, was examined and found to be consistent with her testimony. From newspaper accounts in 1867, they find that Hannah's testimony became public knowledge and created enormous controversy. From a Montgomery newspaper, June 1867, scandalous testimony against prominent families. A Negro woman named Hannah has given testimony to Freedmen's Bureau officials, making shocking accusations against 3 prominent Alabama families. Hannah claims that she was repeatedly violated by Mr. Thomas Whitfield, Mr. William Patterson, and Mr. Robert Harrison during the years she was enslaved by these men. The testimony is extensive and includes disturbing details that cannot be printed in a family newspaper. Several other Negro women have corroborated portions of Hannah's testimony. The accusations have created significant scandal in Montgomery society. The families in question have denied all accusations and claim that Hannah's testimony is motivated by revenge and a desire to destroy respectable white families. However, the detailed nature of Hannah's testimony and the corroboration from other Negro women has led many in the community to believe that at least some of the accusations are truthful. The Whitfield, Patterson, and Harrison families have faced social ostracism, with some families refusing to associate with them. From subsequent newspaper accounts over the following year, Teresa and Marcus trace how Hannah's testimony progressively destroyed the three families' reputations. Social ostracism increased. Business relationships were severed. The families faced declining fortunes and status. Most remarkably, they find a follow-up account Hannah gave in 1875, 10 years after emancipation, reflecting on her decision to testify. "My name is Hannah Freeman. I chose the name Freeman when I became free because it represents freedom from bondage and freedom to speak truth. It is now 1875, 10 years since emancipation, and 9 years since I gave testimony about the sexual violence I experienced during slavery. I am reflecting on that decision and its consequences. When I decided to testify in 1866, I knew that I was unlikely to achieve criminal prosecution of the men who raped me. The legal system in Alabama was not going to punish white men for raping black women, even though slavery had ended. But I also knew that there were other forms of justice beyond criminal prosecution. I knew that if I gave detailed, specific, well-documented testimony, and if that testimony became public knowledge, I could destroy these men's reputations. I could make it impossible for them to hide behind respectability. I could ensure that their families and communities knew what they had done. I have succeeded in this goal. Thomas Whitfield, William Patterson, and Robert Harrison are now known in Montgomery as men who raped enslaved women. Their families have been socially ostracized. Their businesses have suffered. Their names are permanently associated with the crimes they committed. This is not complete justice. Complete justice would have involved criminal prosecution and punishment. But it is justice of a kind. These men can no longer pretend to be respectable. They can no longer hide what they did. I also wanted my testimony to serve a broader purpose, to document for history that sexual violence against enslaved women was systematic and pervasive. I wanted people in the future to understand that this was not about a few bad individuals, but about a system that made black women's bodies property that white men could violate with impunity. The personal cost to me of testifying has been significant. I have faced threats from white supremacists who believe I should not have testified against white men. I have faced criticism from some black people who believe I was foolish to testify when I knew criminal prosecution was unlikely. I have had to relive traumatic experiences repeatedly as I gave testimony, as it was transcribed, as it was discussed publicly. But I do not regret testifying. I needed to speak the truth. I needed to name the men who raped me. I needed to destroy their ability to hide behind silence and respectability. I hope that my testimony will be preserved and that future generations will read it and understand what was done to enslaved women. I hope that by documenting these crimes in such detail, I have helped ensure they will not be forgotten or minimized. Sexual violence was one of slavery's worst crimes, but it was also one of the most hidden. Enslaved women were raped systematically, but we were not allowed to testify about it. And after emancipation, most survivors chose not to speak publicly about what had been done to them because of shame, fear, or the knowledge that the legal system would not provide justice. I chose to speak. I chose to document. I chose to destroy the reputations of the men who raped me by making their crimes public knowledge. This is my contribution to ensuring that this history is not forgotten. Teresa and Marcus spent months verifying Hannah's account and researching what happened to her and to the 3 families after her testimony. They find that Hannah lived until 1899, dying at age 55. She never married, never had children, and worked as a domestic servant for most of her life after emancipation. But she remained active in her community and occasionally spoke about her experiences to other formerly enslaved people and to researchers interested in documenting slavery's history. They find that the 3 families Hannah named, Whitfield, Patterson, and Harrison, all experienced significant social and economic decline after her testimony became public. Business partnerships were dissolved, social invitations ceased, and within a generation all 3 families had left Montgomery and scattered to other locations where their names were not associated with the scandal. Teresa and Marcus also find that Hannah's testimony was preserved and was occasionally referenced by abolitionists and later by historians as one of the most detailed accounts of sexual violence under slavery from a survivor's perspective. 18 months after Teresa first opened that package, the Smithsonian opens the exhibition Breaking Silence, Hannah Freeman's Testimony and the Documentation of Sexual Violence Under Slavery. The exhibition occupies a gallery designed to honor Hannah's courage, while honestly documenting the sexual violence she survived and testified about. The centerpiece is the 1867 photograph of Hannah, taken 2 years after emancipation, around the time she was giving her testimony, showing a young woman whose calm, direct gaze reflects both the trauma she survived and the strength required to testify about it. A detailed explanation accompanies the image. Hannah Freeman was photographed in 1867, around the time she gave over 100 pages of testimony documenting sexual violence she experienced and witnessed during slavery. Between ages 14 and 21, Hannah was raped repeatedly by 3 different enslavers in Alabama. After emancipation, she gave detailed testimony naming these men and documenting their crimes. Her testimony destroyed the reputations of 3 prominent Alabama families and provided crucial documentation of sexual violence as a systematic feature of slavery. The exhibition tells Hannah's story through her testimony, corroborating evidence from other survivors, newspaper accounts of the scandal her testimony created, and her 1875 reflection on her decision to testify. The exhibition does not shy away from difficult content. It includes Hannah's descriptions of the violence she experienced, though presented in a way that honors survivors while documenting historical truth. One section examines the systematic nature of sexual violence under slavery, using Hannah's testimony and other historical sources to show that her experience was not unusual. Most enslaved women experienced or witnessed sexual violence, but few were able to document it or testify about it publicly. Another section focuses on Hannah's decision to testify, despite knowing criminal prosecution was unlikely, showing how she understood that destroying her rapists' reputations through public testimony was a form of justice, even without legal punishment. The exhibition documents the impact of Hannah's testimony, the scandal it created, the social ostracism the 3 families faced, the economic decline they experienced, and their eventual departure from Montgomery. Newspaper accounts and personal correspondence from the period show how Hannah's detailed, well-documented testimony made it impossible for the families to simply deny the accusations. A section on the cost of testimony shows the threats Hannah faced, the trauma of having to repeatedly recount her experiences, and the courage required to speak publicly about sexual violence in a society that wanted to maintain silence about these crimes. The exhibition includes broader context about other survivors who gave testimony after emancipation, showing that while Hannah's testimony was unusually detailed and public, other formerly enslaved women also worked to document sexual violence, despite enormous obstacles. A video plays continuously, featuring historians discussing sexual violence under slavery, the importance of survivor testimony, and why Hannah's detailed documentation is so valuable for understanding this hidden history. On opening day, Teresa stands in the gallery watching visitors engage with the exhibition. She sees people study Hannah's photograph, understanding the strength visible in that direct, calm gaze. The strength of someone who survived years of trauma and then chose to testify about it publicly. Marcus stands beside her, looking at the image. Hannah was 23 years old when this photograph was taken, he says quietly. She'd been free for 2 years. She'd spent the past year giving detailed testimony about being raped repeatedly from age 14 to 21. She knew her testimony wouldn't result in criminal prosecution, but she testified anyway because she understood that documenting the truth and destroying her rapists' reputations was a form of justice. Look at her expression. She's not broken, not defeated. She's steady, determined. She survived, and she made sure her voice was heard. A young black woman approaches them after spending a long time in the exhibition, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for this," she says. Hannah survived 7 years of systematic sexual violence. Then she testified in extraordinary detail, naming her rapists, documenting what they did. She destroyed their reputations through truth-telling. That took incredible courage. Her testimony is one of the most important documents we have about sexual violence under slavery. She made sure these crimes couldn't be hidden or forgotten. An elderly white woman stops to read Hannah's 1875 reflection for a long time. Hannah says her testimony destroyed the reputations of 3 families, she says, reading the newspaper accounts, seeing how they were socially ostracized and economically ruined. That's what happened. Hannah couldn't get criminal prosecution, but she got justice of a kind by making sure everyone knew what these men had done. The truth destroyed their ability to hide behind respectability. Throughout the day, visitors engaged deeply with the exhibition, understanding that Hannah's testimony represents both the horror of sexual violence under slavery and the courage of survivors who chose to document and testify about crimes that society wanted to keep hidden. As the museum prepares to close that evening, Teresa walks through the gallery one more time. She stops in front of Hannah's photograph, looking at that steady, direct gaze. She thinks about Hannah, 14 years old when Thomas Whitfield began raping her. Surviving 7 years of systematic sexual violence by 3 different men, keeping secret documentation throughout slavery, because she believed there would someday be opportunity to testify, giving over 100 pages of detailed testimony after emancipation, despite knowing criminal prosecution was unlikely, destroying the reputations of 3 prominent families through truth-telling, living until 1899, having ensured that her testimony was preserved and that the crimes committed against her were documented for history. She thinks about the 3 men, Thomas Whitfield, William Patterson, and Robert Harrison, who raped Hannah and other enslaved women for years, who hid behind respectability and silence during slavery, and whose reputations were destroyed when Hannah testified and made their crimes public knowledge. And she thinks about all the other enslaved women who experienced sexual violence but never had opportunity to testify, whose stories were lost or hidden, whose suffering was never documented or acknowledged. The photograph waited 158 years to tell Hannah's complete story. The image that shows a young woman with a calm, steady gaze has become testimony to survival, to the courage required to document and testify about sexual violence, and to the power of truth-telling to destroy reputations built on hidden crimes. Now, the photograph and exhibition have fulfilled a purpose Hannah surely intended when she chose to testify. Her story has been preserved and honored. Her detailed documentation has been recognized as one of the most important accounts of sexual violence under slavery. Her courage in naming her rapists and destroying their reputations has been celebrated, and future generations can understand that sexual violence was systematic under slavery, and that survivors like Hannah worked to ensure these crimes would be documented and remembered, despite all efforts to maintain silence. As visitors file past the image one last time, many stopping to look at Hannah's direct gaze and see the strength and determination behind her decision to testify, Teresa reflects on all the other survivors whose testimony deserves to be preserved and honored, all the other acts of courage involved in documenting crimes that society wanted hidden, all the other stories that prove silence can be broken and truth can destroy the reputations of those who committed hidden crimes. Hannah Freeman, born enslaved 1844, raped repeatedly by 3 enslavers between ages 14-21, secretly documented the violence during slavery, gave over 100 pages of detailed testimony after emancipation, naming her rapists and documenting their crimes, destroyed the reputations of 3 prominent Alabama families through truth-telling, lived until 1899, having ensured her testimony was preserved for history. Her story has been told. Her courage has been honored. And Teresa is grateful to have played a part in ensuring that Hannah Freeman is remembered as someone who survived years of horrific violence and then chose to testify about it with extraordinary detail and courage, who destroyed her rapists' reputations through truth-telling when criminal prosecution was impossible, and who provided one of the most important documented accounts of sexual violence under slavery, ensuring that these crimes would not be hidden or forgotten, but would be preserved as testimony to both the horrors of slavery and the courage of survivors who refused to remain silent.